Yeah. Okay. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands and waterways on which Deakin University does business. We pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of the Wadawurrung country, Eastern Ma country, and Wurundjeri country, where Deakin University's physical campuses are located. We acknowledge all First Nations people who contribute to our learning and communities. We have three presenters in this session, Lynn McCredden, Timothy Jones, and Vivian Gerrand. And Lynn is recording. Are you pressing record? Pressing play, or am I pressing play?
Just pressing play from there.
Just pressing play. All right.
In the contemporary discipline of literary studies, there is a pervasive cynicism about the category of the sacred, let alone the efficacy of anything called religious statement. Such cynicism arises from those who would maintain the secularity of Australia. What I want to do today is flip the notion of the secular upside down, examining the sacred roots of a number of contemporary Australian literary artists. I will argue that purportedly secular nation, Australia has an astonishing range of writers in the sacred. Patrick White, Helen Garner, Les Murray, Nick Cave, Tim Winton, Christos Cholkas, Indigenous writers such as Murray poet Lionel Fogarty, Sam Wagon, For Lionel Fogarty, the lifelong Aboriginal activist and poet, his Murray culture is ripe with sacred resonances, intimately entwined in the material and the earth. Elsewhere, I have called his particular poetic production a guerrilla mysticism. Fogarty's poems are dense verbal structures which employ and produce both spiritual and political effort. What he reaches for are, quote, words beyond any acceptable meaning. This is how I express my dream. The poet invokes fourth world traditions and uses English, the white language, as he says, to encapsulate the spirit of anger and to transform a good spirit. Spiritual well-being, Fogarty, and many Aboriginal activists and artists embraces dream, customs, culture, law, song, dance, communal identity, the sacredness of earth and of human relations to earth, all aspects which have consistently informed the political and the sacred in Fogarty's poetry. The well-being of his people is a constant lodestar in his work. In his confronting early poem, Urban Black, from his first volume, Cargill, in 1980, Fogarty takes on the voice of an Aboriginal man, a tribal person, speaking from his traditional place, urging urban blacks to return to their land, to refuse the disinheriting urban life of dumps and crime, of landlessness and lack of rights. He promises that if they come, you'll find the tribe that roamed the land that is now dumps. You'll find your customs are to carry on. Once done, you know you don't want this before. Go back to find you are related to Aboriginal or faraway green. Go out, help them fight now for land rights. With its echoes of Oodgeroo's iconic poem, We Are Going, but without that poem's arguably tragic sense of defeat and vastness, Fogarty adopts a different kind of nostalgia, one based on political protest and redemptive action. Go back, go out, help them fight. But along with this overt guerrilla stance, a gentler longing twines through this poem. Poetic self-awareness of its own deep nostalgia, and perhaps the impossibility of what is overtly called for. There is an awareness that the faraway green of tribes that roam the land that is now dumps is a lyrical dream, slipped in between more muscly calls to move, to fight, to construct a different now. Both impulses together, the guerrilla and the lyrical, are modes of imagining new possibilities. The hard real-world warrior and the dreaming poet mutually engaged in the quest for well-being. Moving back now some 20 years to Patrick White's monumental novel, Riders in the Chariot, we are presented with four vulnerable characters who are, in different ways, subject to the harsh godlessness of Australia in the 1950s, because they are different, judged as deficient or supposedly dim-witted. One is an Aboriginal man, an artist and a drunk. White's epigraph to Riders in the Chariot is in the voice of 19th century poet William Blake, and wonderfully encapsulates the spirit of White's fiction. I quote, "The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel dined with me, and I asked them how they dared to so roundly to assert that God spoke to them, and whether they did not think at the time that they would be misunderstood, and so be the cause of imposition. Isaiah answered, I saw no God, nor heard any in a finite organical perception, but my senses discovered the infinite in everything. And as I was then persuaded and remained confirmed that the voice of honest indignation is the voice of God, I cared not for consequences, but wrote. I then asked Ezekiel why he eat dung and lay so long on his right and left side. He answered, the desire of raising other men, sick, into a perception of the infinite. This is the North American tribe's practice. And is he honest who resists his genius or conscience only for the sake of present ease or gratification? Unquote. Again and again, it is to the excluded, the despised, and the dim-witted that Patrick White gives the imprimatur of prophet or visionary. Note the way in which Blake draws together artistic genius and conscience. They were never far apart in Blake's own poetry, and they both entailed risk, poverty, and exclusion for him. So in Riders in the Chariot, Mary Hare, Ruth Godbold, Mordecai Himmelfarb, and Elf Dubbo become an unlikely company of riders, joined together in a community of the humble and the scorned, but also by the acts of kindness and succour they offer others. Critic Morel Jacau, in her 2018 essay on Riders in the Chariot, writes this: only the chosen four share an intimation of the divine unity underlying the everyday. White referred to his protagonists as the riders, after the chariot seen by the exiled Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, a potent symbol of heavenly ascension in Jewish mysticism. One early strand of this mysticism, the critic says, focuses on ecstatic experience and is literally called chariot mysticism, Nekava. The characteristic white dialogue between literary and spiritual is highlighted in a comment of White to his agent in 1959. What I want to emphasize to my four riders, he wrote, is that all faiths, religious, humanistic, instinctive, or the creative artist's act of praise, are in fact one. His prose in Riders of the Chariot moves between the tiniest and most mundane of earthy details and a perception of universal spiritual awareness. From the ordinary suburb of sarsaparilla to the divine is a small step in this extraordinarily concentrated dialogue between the literary and the sacred, as White creates powerful models of imaginative openness to a pervasive spiritual realm. Mere glimpses, possibilities of meaning or purpose or joy or insight are defined by their absence in Helen Garner's description of her character, Janet, in Cosmolino. Here is Janet. She scorned many things. All she believed in was the physical, the practical, the stoical. Bite the bullet, she said. Plug on, one foot in front of the other, and keep going. She had no children. Her family was scattered. She was too proud to take advice or sympathy. To a woman like Janet, nothing is more enfeebling than pity. And so she fell out with all her friends. There's a tension here, isn't there, if not a contradiction, between the dogged, dull plugging on of the character and the way the energy of the prose here pulses. Those short, crisp sentences reflecting a sinewy, watered vigor. Such vigor seems to undermine or at least set up a gap in which the reader might want to question the nature of Janet's repressions. So much scorning and stoicism. In the wonderfully named Sweet Pea Mansions, the reader might feel the old serendipities of late 60s, early 70s shared houses, possibly not including the hellholes of Monkey Grip, warm echoes of connection, shared meanings, even a renewed sense of hope and well-being. Garner at first writes purposefully and overtly of failed dreams, of Janet's bleak nostalgia, of the character's thoughtlessness and lack of community, and of ways Janet seeks to repress such emotions and needs, so that Sweet Pea Mansions becomes an almost Gothic scene of anti-epiphanies. Janet's abortive communal dinner where no one turns up. Maxine's ironized baby longings, her petty theft, and her not quite immaculate conception and angelic escape. And Ray and Elby's fecklessness. And yet the tiny pinpricks of remembered meaning, remembered joy, keep Janet not afloat, then recalling possibilities against her own will. Quote, sometimes now in the empty house, she heard her own footsteps hurry past on the other side of the room. Her own voice, more girlish, laughing in a closed room. Unwelcome memories of happiness rustled behind her or pounced from doorways. She remembered being the youngest person present, being a student with a job, how it was to tie on an apron and slap together sandwiches in the shop, taking orders, chiacking with the customers, to have sore feet from standing up all day to serve, and later the surprised pride of being a cleaner on the promotions list, of belonging to a union and knowing where she fitted into society. In a marvellous essay on Garner, Critic and writer Tegan Bennett Daylight writes of what she sees as Garner's sense of the spiritual. It seems a terrible shame to me that critics, in their rush to disavow something so tasteless, so unfashionable as belief, miss something so rich and deep in Garner's work. By becoming helpless before God, she also became helpless before metaphor. We are the richer for it. We don't condemn Toni Morrison or Marilyn Robinson or even Herman Melville for the use of biblical metaphor. We try to be respectful of other beliefs, of Islam, of Hinduism, of Aboriginal spirituality, but probably not of Christianity. Many of the characters in Tim Winton's short story collection, The Turning, are down and outers, aware of, longing for what they cannot see or grasp. In the story Aquifer, the third story in the collection, the adult narrator slowly comes to recall details from childhood, to be aware of his repressed memories and an event of drowning as he contemplates the invisible forces which still impose themselves on his imagination. Quote, "The brown land, I figured, wasn't just wide but deep too. All that dust on the surface, the powder of ash and bones, bark and skin. The air sometimes turns pink with the flying dirt of the deserts, pink and corporeal. And beneath the crust, rising and falling with the tide, the soup, the juice of things filters down strong and pure and mobile as time itself finding its own measure. All the dead alive in the land, all the lost who bank up, mounting in layers of silt and humus, all the creatures and plants making thermoclines in seas and rivers and estuaries. I have, boy and man, felt the dead in my very water." These are the idiosyncratic, often abject ponderings of an adult narrator, speaking partly through his innocent childhood self, contemplating the forces of time and death, the juice of things, the deed. In childlike enthrallment, the adult narrator registers the child's awareness of human and non-human forces, the tidal ebb and flow that pays no special regard to human existence. The sense of astonishment and even horror is apprehended in Aquifer by the adult who respects his childhood vision. Such realization emanates both from the fervid consideration of the child and the more poised but enthralled recollections of the adult. There is disturbance, but also spiritual awe in this realization. I have, boy and man, felt the dead in my very water. A sense of release and well-being arises in the man at this moment, remembering forces well beyond his solitariness. But not all the stories of the turning end with this kind of release. In fact, the stories mostly oscillate between characters' faint hopes of renewal or understanding and bleak representations of lives that seem to promise nothing. The eponymous story traces the effects of religious conversion in the lives of Dan and Sherry and their interactions with Raylene, a battered and desperate wife, part of the so-called white trash from the caravan. Raylene is seeking something, she's not quite sure what: friendship, understanding, hope, beyond her embattled life with Max, her abusive and violent partner. Quote, "On Tuesday, she gave darts the flick, She launched into Dan and Sherry about religion, about how she didn't believe a word of it and how sick of bloody hypocrite she was. She gave it to them about Pope and George W. Bush and the priests who abused children, and it just didn't help matters that they keep nodding and agreeing. She ran out of puff. Dan put the kettle on. "You never have any booze in this house," said Raylene, laughing to mask her awful embarrassment. There's a reason for that," said Sherry, smoothing down her skirt. "Because you're churchy, right?" "Actually," said Dan, "it's because I'm an alcoholic." There is both humour and poignancy in this depiction of Raylene's suspiciousness about religion and her own neediness. Winton's lists of jibes against religion put into Raylene's mouth are a little bit of a black in-joke, totting up Pope, George W., bad priests and churchiness as accusations against organised religion. But readers are brought up with the small jolt, as is Raylene, and Dan reveals that his Christian conversion has enabled him to become free of his alcoholism. Turning as a metaphor and as the title of the story and the collection is significant. In Christian usages, conversion involves repentance, the ancient Greek metanoia, a turning, a changing of the mind, a healing, a being forgiven. There is no judgmentalism towards any of the characters in the authorial voice, I would argue, but a thoroughgoing, open registering of Raylene's broken human neediness. Under the kindness and tutelage of Dan and Sherry, quote, Raylene warmed to the idea of Jesus and the business of forgiveness, and was at points close to turning, but we read, she didn't believe. The born-again business, asked Raylene. What's it like? Like a hot knife going into me, murmured Sherry, sounding all foggy, a woman with her pillow voice on. Like I was butter and there was this knife opening me up. That's the best way I can describe it. Raylene could only nod, saddened but somehow fortified in the knowledge, the confirmation this gave her that she didn't believe. She'd come near, she was sure, from desperation, from outright need. For a few days, she thought she was only an arm's length, a breath away from copping something. But there was no piercing moment, no sudden, unmistakable feeling. You're happy then, she asked, you and Dan? Lucky, said Sherry. Grateful, very happy. Raylene calls it the born-again business, who wanted to know not the theology of conversion, but how it feels. She is seeking a persuasive king hit, a redemption, all things she can't quite feel or believe in. Raylene's honesty with herself and her facing the demons of her husband's violence are depicted in deeply ambivalent, unresolved terms that refuse any simple sense of redemption. In the macabre last scene of the story, we are left to ponder whether Raylene has found her own way of turning, her own conversion, whether spiritual and or pragmatic. In the middle of being raped again by her brutalizing and brutalized husband, Raylene turns to look at the snow dome with the figure of Jesus, which she had bought on a shopping expedition with Sherry. And we read, in the spill of light at the bedside, she saw the little dome and her man upon the waves. She said his name too, said it aloud with love enough to send a shudder through Max as he pushed her down. She knew she was safe from him now, not safe from tonight, but gone from him altogether. He smelt of death already, of burning, of bile and acid. He was crying, and she did not pity him. He was gone, and it didn't matter when. Everything was new. In her dome, it snowed birds as the van knocked, birds like stars. The moment Max speared her and tore open her inside, she was full of hot and certain feeling. She was free. She had already outlived him. This is a deeply, shockingly ambivalent representation. But of what? Of redemption and freedom, of rape and the continuance of violence rather than redemption. Readers are submitted to both hope for Raylene's well-being and deep uncertainty about the efficacy of religious faith for earthly redemption. And in conclusion, any gaining of knowledge about well-being yoked to sacred belief in the literature of Fogarty, White, Garner, and Winton must, it seems, pass through the fires of unknowing, a listening to the tumultuous voice of honest indignation which Blake names. But perhaps, as Blake also wrote, that is the voice of God, discernible amongst dung and violence and red earth and suburbs of Australia. Thank you very much.
Was that recorded? Yes.
All right.
They're all up. Are these being recorded?
Yes, everything.
No, I don't need that. I mean, is that live?
Oh, that was a recording. Pre-recording.
Pre-recorded.
Yeah. So next we have Timothy Jones from Notre University. And straight up.
Thanks, Rosie, for that fulsome introduction.
You can introduce yourself.
My name is Tim Jones. I'm a historian of religion, sexuality, and gender. And recently I've been masquerading as a sociologist in my work on LGBT conversion practices. Don't uncover me. I guess in the last 10 years, I've been doing projects that have been looking at different types of religious trauma, failures in pastoral care in the context of child sexual abuse in religious institutions, and attempts to change or suppress people's sexuality or gender identity. And that has been very wearing, and I'm a bit sick of working on trauma. And so I've been percolating this idea, which I'm just starting now, to look at histories of kind of spiritual health, healthcare, and as I was sort of thinking about what kind of catalyst or focus to look at, it occurred to me that wellness industries might be like a useful kind of framework to think about spiritual healthcare, and particularly thinking about the burgeoning population of non-religious people who, as we know from the work of people in this network, are still engaging with ideas about spirituality and seeking spiritual health care. So, so I have a application currently under assessment, and hopefully I'll get funded to do it. So my paper, unlike everyone's papers so far, have seemed to be really, really polished about books they've already written, whereas I'm kind of coming from the other end of things. At the beginning of a project, I'm kind of like mapping out the way I'm thinking about perspective work. And I also feel a little bit, I feel like most of you are like sociologists or social researchers, and I'm coming at this kind of from the perspective of a historian, where historians haven't really grappled with ideas about non-religious spirituality. I haven't found any work on that. This isn't quite the right. Well, the slides that are on the screen are not the final version of the slides. So this is going to be a bit novel. We'll see what happens.
That's very exciting.
So, the final version of the slides was really, really beautiful, and kind of was a bit meta because I think approaching wellness industries in the present moment, they're so ubiquitous. It's kind of hard to think outside of that moment. Like it's kind of become the hegemonic culture, so much so that the AI of the latest version of PowerPoint just populated with these images. I didn't draw these images. I just like typed it in and came up with all this wellness kind of culture imagery, and the final version of the PowerPoint had even more amazing AI wellness imagery, which was really beautiful. But anyway, so the kind of structure of my probably rambly talk is starting from the point of the importance of historicizing the present moment. I've been kind of thinking about this for about the last year. I've not found any historical work on wellness industries at all. And the narratives that do exist, including in scholarly literature from other disciplines, are basically just picking up the self-authored narratives of wellness industry entrepreneurs. So there's a really uncritical engagement with genealogies and notions of authenticity and authority in wellness culture. So I'm proposing, I've got a really great slide, and I hope it does turn up. It's my fault. I emailed you the wrong version, obviously. I've sort of developed a historical framework or a metaphor, which I hope will be useful in understanding wellness industries, and also in situating non-religious spirituality in wellness culture. So, on the final version of the slides here, I had a methods kind of theory kind of thing, and when I said pastoral power, PowerPoint produced this gorgeous landscape of like a field of wheat with wind turbines coming out of it, which is not what Foucault would have thought about when he was developing his ideas about pastoral power. But I just thought it was serendipitous and beautiful. So the approach that I'm taking to this is, so most historians, when they have looked at religion and religious history, haven't really gotten out of the secularization kind of narrative of like what religion is and when or where is it ending, dying, or not dying. And I really don't care about that question. I'm much more interested in how religious or religious-like or spiritual cultures function and operate for people. And I think, this is also, that's probably makes a lot of sense to you, but if I was talking to historians, I would belabor this point a little bit more about how does spiritual culture function for people and what does it mean? And I think particularly in the present moment, historicizing the sort of logic of, I think the extent to which spirituality has become a technique of neoliberal governmentality. We've internalized these notions of self-care, peculiarly, Foucault's care of the self and self-care. There's like really sometimes claustrophobic resonances in this work. So the history that does exist, like there's really interesting histories in terms of the histories of medicine and histories of secularization. You see, even in the histories of secularization, we're getting into sociologists like Linda Woodhead's The Spiritual Religion. I'm not sure. I haven't found historians who are dealing with ideas about spirituality and non-religion yet. So doing kind of genealogy of that and mapping that onto genealogies of healthcare. A key, it sort of doesn't make sense to talk about spiritual healthcare outside of the context of the European world and the European Enlightenment, and like Foucault's whole project is critiquing the Enlightenment, and so his histories of medicine and mental health, critiques of modernity. But there's that notion that in the Enlightenment, the mind, body, and spirit were kind of divorced, and so pre-Enlightenment Europe, most healthcare was provided by religious institutions and spiritual and physical and mental health were like integrated. And after that point, through the beautiful processes that Roy Porter describes as a social historian of health, the way in which disciplines of healthcare, define their boundaries, and sort of quackery and real medicine like emerge and evolve over periods of time. But in the last 200 years or so, religion becomes sort of separated from what we understand as biomedicine now. But almost immediately, there are counter movements where people try to reintegrate holistic notions of holistic healthcare. And I found it really useful in the workshop yesterday, thinking about, particularly in the Australian context, where certainly people of sort of my generation and older, are a bit shy about talking about religion and religious beliefs. Talking about like holistic healthcare is a bit of like a subtle way to get people to think about religion and spirituality and meaning making. So I'm talking to those literatures, and in starting this project, a little bit shocked at the absence of literature to talk to. This is a bit sad. So I might even abandon the PowerPoint. So the histories of the wellness industry that we have are largely driven by the sort of entrepreneurial, like really the industry side of the wellness culture, if you like. And in the last 15 years, there's been a lot of sort of industry-generated research, and I almost want to put inverted commas around the research because of some of the quality and the assumptions based in it. But there's there's an industry peak body called which in the early 2000s was called the Global Spa Summit, which became the Global Wellness Summit, and then they founded a Global Wellness Institute, which produces these reports and national surveys and different types of things. And they predict, in a figure that's like commonly quoted, that in 2025 the global wellness industry will be worth $7 trillion. I'm fairly confident that the table of industry sectors that I produce is not on that PowerPoint. But there are the sectors that are in there include like personal care and beauty, healthy eating, physical activity, tourism, public health, wellness, real estate, mental wellness, spas, workplace, and curiously spas and springs, health springs, are separated, I think, for historical reasons. Which kind of illustrates to me, and like in terms of like the figure of 7 trillion, like the vast majority of that is personal care and beauty, healthy eating, and physical activity, things which historically are not particularly holistic. They're not actually concerned like with the whole person, but there's an extent in which in the last 20 years, in which wellness has become hegemonic, that things are being branded as wellness. So Gwyneth Paltrow's Empire Goop, which some of you may be familiar with, is kind of illustrative of that end of the spectrum, in which she is kind of engaged in thinking holistically about human well-being, but the big driver of it is selling flowing linen frocks and ice cream and vibrators and things, which I subscribe to the blog newsletter thing, and it does make me feel like slightly well when I read through her little blurb and the different products, and like wish that I was more and I could wear those floating dresses in a way that doesn't really fit my masky kind of body. But there's something that works in it, even though it is neoliberal capitalism and exploitative and everything else. So it's got this kind of hegemonic, very significantly marketing kind of thing with different degrees. That's kind of a spectrum of engagement in holistic well-being. I'll be back to that. They often make really curious historical tales about authenticity, usually going back to Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine. So there's this kind of like other non-Western cultures have holistic notions of well-being, which we are like authentically continuing, sometimes appropriating First Nations medical cultures, but less than people assume, I think. Perhaps it's different in different countries. Like I mentioned, in the US, there's more stuff about sweat lodges and things. I haven't found so much. I was anticipating that would be more use of First Nations culture in Australia and Australian wellness industries. Maybe that's something that will happen soon. Curiously, almost no reference to ancient Greek and Roman medicine, which is similarly holistic, and actually for Western culture, actually has a much stronger genealogy, as Foucault is looking at in his notions about partial power. He goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and most of my ancient historian friends critique his historical analysis of the sort of change that he articulates as happening with Christianity. But notions of holistic healthcare in sort of ancient Mediterranean European world are kind of what we're looking at in wellness culture today as well. But curiously, the wellness industry doesn't go there. Like, there's something interesting about where they look for authenticity, and often they go to like Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine, and then jump to sometimes acknowledging the 19th century movements towards holistic healthcare in homeopathy, the temperance movement. I had a beautiful picture of Weet-Bix for Australians. This, Seventh-day Adventists created this food empire about healthy eating. Kellogg's in the US and more globally, this gestures towards holistic health. So there's this sort of common and I think fairly widespread reaction against that Enlightenment separation of spiritual and physical and mental health. The discourse of wellness comes specifically from public health. In the middle of the 20th century, Albert Dunn was a public health statistician in the United States, and his book High Level Wellness is the kind of root of modern wellness specific discourse, and it was picked up in the 70s by some other public health and medical doctors who then became wellness entrepreneurs, established wellness centers, developed diagnostic models, and really shifted from the public health perspective and the social movement stuff of the 19th century into individual responsibility for wellness. And there's this really strong history across the sort of popular histories of the wellness movement, that you've got like ancient wellness culture, you've got 19th century kind of struggles towards it. There's this like World Health Organization and these like founding fathers of the wellness movement in the US, Howard Dunn, John Travis, Don Ardell. But actually, even just like their own publications show that this was a widespread culture of movements towards holistic understandings of health. So it's a common post-Enlightenment impulse. It's kind of happening everywhere kind of at the same time. I found a really beautiful story about the first GP at the Australian National University, Brian Furness, who established a wellness institute there. He didn't have quite the same mastery of words as Albert Dunn. He called it health rather than ilth, and tried to find his own, just ilth and health just didn't catch on. But it's the same notion of holistic stuff. And I think what I also want to do with this project is move beyond the focus on sort of anti-capitalist critiques of neoliberalism to look at across class and gender lines the way in which people are moving into holistic holistic health and thinking in a more complex ways about cultural appropriation and cultural diplomacy and cultural exchange, because I think the agency and the flows of paraknowledge there are more complex. And I have a bit of a river metaphor, and I have a lovely slide of the Ganges River to borrow strategies from one's culture of appropriating things and ascribing authenticity to other cultures. But I feel like the map of the Ganges River kind of captures this history really lovely, because you can think about the sort of tributary movements of spas, springs, complementary medicine, healthy eating, like long-standing holistic health practices, which sort of come together in the middle of the 1950s and are branded as wellness. And then in the last 20 years, when wellness becomes this kind of neoliberal hegemony, it sort of spreads into this large delta of like shallow, but I think also genuine interest in wellness. And thinking about non-religious spirituality in this context, it's omnipresent, it's everywhere in this culture. There's a spectrum from really focused attention to spiritual well-being and health to the vaguest sort of marketing halo around, you know, a linen frock or a lipstick or whatever. But what's really interesting about this is that wellness discourse provides perhaps the earliest and most consistent articulation of non-religious spiritual care. So Harvard Sun, John Travis and Don Adele in the 50s, 60s and 70s are articulating spiritual care in non-religious terms, like decades, generations perhaps, before this has become something of a concern for historians and sociologists. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And the last speaker on this panel is Vivian Gerrand. Gerrand. I'm trying to make it French, but
It is actually a French surname, but in Australia it tends to be pronounced as Gerrand, and I don't speak French very well.
and Vivian is from Deakin University, and I will hand back over to you, and I'll kind of be sitting there making your hand signals about timing.
I'm not sure quite what to do with that. Technical support, please. So just trying to put it on together. Thank you. Where's the mouse on? Did we get Rudy?
I know.
Yes, please.
We can, although it's PC, not.
Not having much luck with the PowerPoints today.
Maybe we'll find all of Tim's slides on your.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's yeah. Yeah, I've got some
All parts.
Absolutely. I'm always.
Yeah, it won't let us do it.
More mainstream social, like just a standard sociology rather than like a social voice of it.
Oh, perfect.
I don't think it will be a problem.
Yeah,
Is that
right.
everything you need?
Let's find out. I think so. Yeah. Just yeah. Okay, great. It seems to be working. Okay. There's that. Thank you. Thanks. Great. Thanks a lot, Rosie.
Thanks, Rosie.
I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples, unceded lands, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also really want to thank Anna Halifax for inviting me to present today. It's a really exciting set of papers and it's really stimulating my thinking on these issues. So I'm also presenting a work in progress today. So this is a project just looking at mapping conspiritual radicalisation. So I'm coming from the perspective of a cultural sociologist who is an expert on radicalisation and resilience trajectories. So I'm really trying to understand the nuances behind some of the radicalisation that we have seen, particularly in the peak pandemic years, in alternative health and wellness spaces. So I titled the talk Narrative, Needs and Networks because I think I'm using the idea of that has been theorised within radicalisation studies of the idea that people need narratives, needs and networks to become involved in radicalisation. And it's also an approach that valorises treating such communities with empathy. So approaching those who are at risk of radicalising or those who are in some way drawn towards radicalising materials with the kind of empathy and an approach that looks at the bigger picture and the holistic systems and structures within which they are living. So I begin along these lines by problematizing pipelines. So we've heard a lot about pipelines in the pandemic, people who are into yoga, then suddenly they're voting for Trump. And there certainly has been a lot of online activity that is potentially radicalizing for people. And I'm not disagreeing with some of that work, which is important. And there's a lot of really critical work being done around the kinds of algorithms and platforms that people are accessing. But I think it's important also that we reclaim the complexity of radicalisation by looking at some of the structural factors. And we heard this morning also in Paul's paper, the need to attend to the local circumstances that inflect these kinds of trajectories. So my work is very much interested in looking at the local specificity of particular people's trajectories of radicalisation. And I'm currently doing some pilot interviews, in-depth interviews with members of health and wellness communities, both here in Melbourne and Victoria, so both city Melbourne and rural Victoria. And also I've had the great opportunity, thanks to a small sociology and social change Kickstarter grant, to do a little bit of scoping work in northern Italy. So there've been some really interesting things, developments there in health and wellness communities that have a long-term investment in alternative health, for example, and have strong anti-vaccine attitudes and opposed very strongly some of the restrictions that we saw during the COVID-19 years. So my approach is one of understanding grievances, that's the next part of the talk, and then thinking about the environment of trust or lack of trust and the ways in which certain kinds of influences operate in this low trust environment. I then finish by asking what we can learn from radicalisation and associated experiences of COVID-19 within alternative health and wellness communities. So what kinds of insights are coming out of these experiences? Why are we seeing this radicalisation? How can we see it as something potentially positive even? I like to think of radicalisation not necessarily as something negative. I've just published a chapter which considers radicalisation in terms of its potential pro-social ends. So we can think about things like radicalisation in Extinction Rebellion, radicalisation to stop big corporations from destroying the planet, basically. So I think it's important that we reclaim that aspect of radicalisation when thinking about these spaces, because there are many within them that are also concerned about our planetary futures, as Anna pointed out earlier as well.
Excuse me, Vivian, we just had a request for you to speak up.
Sorry.
No, you're right.
So again, problematizing pipelines. So there's been some work on people that have radicalized through going on TikTok, for example, accessing certain kinds of material, and then coming across other kinds of material that might lead them into far-right spaces, transphobia, for example. So the work that I'm doing is getting away from some of this and more looking at what is in the background, what isn't online. I mean, they're all interrelated, obviously, but thinking in terms of this complex picture of the conducive environment that people are within and the ways in which certain things that they may see or appeal of people online through selling points appeal to them, but because of their conducive environment, they're not happening in a vacuum. So I really want to get away from this idea that by going online, by going on TikTok, you can suddenly become a radical. So I don't think it's that simple. All the literature on radicalisation suggests it's not. So it's important to reclaim that complexity of it and the nuance of it. There's been some really interesting work in this space over the past few years, particularly with my colleagues such as Anna Halakoff and others, by Parmijani and by Stephanie Alice Baker, who's done some really interesting work on wellness cultures. And a lot of these studies have shown some key insights into why alternative health and wellness spaces are, I suppose, becoming in a way radicalized. And some of these things involve responses to crisis. So in a time of uncertainty, some of these influences promote certainty. They promote cultures of purity and detox cultures, for example, in a time of disease. The idea that one can have control over one's body and bodily autonomy and sovereignty, the magical thinking aspect highlighted in a great article by Parmijani. Understandings of gender that are fairly reified. So returning to an understanding of a certain kind of masculinity and femininity that can also intersect in a way with some of the transphobia that we're seeing in alternative rights spaces. The idea of questioning and doing one's own research, seeing this crisis as an opportunity for awakening. All of these things have been covered in the literature and are very helpful to thinking through some of these questions. Thinking about the low trust environment, there's a reason why these, as was mentioned in Timothy's talk, there's a reason why these wellness influences have a particular kind of resonance. They may be branded as the disinformation dozen. That doesn't stop people from accessing their materials and finding them useful. And so understanding the kinds of truths or post-truths that are being presented in these environments is really critical. While we may view them as disinformation and conspiracy-oriented and potentially a health threat when they stop people from getting vaccinated, they also touch upon things that are potentially being neglected in our more common public health response that are worth attending to. So trying to understand what's actually happening, what the grievances are, why people are gravitating towards these sorts of spaces. I'm not just thinking of them as being foolish or deplorables, thinking more in terms of where they're actually coming from and what are their genuine interests that are resonating in these spaces is very critical. In Italy as well, we see some of these materials very popular within the conspiritual milieus, and in a recent fieldwork that I was doing on the ground there in Bolzano, I met someone who was getting her information from a BYO Blue website where they sell books like a lot of books translated from English, but also ones that are published within the Italian context. So ideas about the pandemic that have come out of the United States, like The True Anthony Fauci by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a manual to defend oneself for sovereigns within the Italian context, stop vaccination, the truth about Ukraine. So we've also seen within these spaces a shift towards some of the conspiracies coming out, also the disinformation coming out of Russia, and so the ways in which those also intersect, and then surviving in this new world order, and then the internet, the tsunami of the internet, plus products that are tied to holistic health, supplements to improve vitamin C and D and zinc and echinacea levels in the body, blue light glasses, so a defense against a particular world order that is potentially threatening to health. This paper is partly based on a chapter that I wrote recently about alternative health influences, such as Dr. Christian Northrup, who is someone who in the pandemic went from being a Western medical doctor who had published New York Times best-selling books, Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom, The Wisdom of Menopause, to promoting anti-vaccine ideas about things like shedding, the idea that if someone is vaccinated, they then shed. If your partner is vaccinated, you should leave them. This is her advice. And she's also migrated to alternative web platforms like Telegram and Gab, where she's promoting ideas of militant self-defense against public health, say vaccination mandates, etc., and advocating for potentially using violence to protect children against vaccines. So I've also talked about this idea of potential militancy in some of these spaces. I've used the term militant wellness in the past. I do think in a minority of people, there is this very militant self-defense against perceived tyranny of public health measures. So it can be quite alarming to see some material, again, moving towards and then seeing what happens in some of the spaces once people were deplatformed, particularly at the end of 2020. Many of them migrated to alternative web channels like Telegram, where they were not having their content moderated. And so they were promoting ideas, for example, around things like pure blood. So the idea that if you're not vaccinated, you are a pure blood. You can meet other pure bloods on a pure blood dating site. So using terms that were in use also during Nazi Germany. But my understanding from speaking with many members of these communities is that that term is not associated by many people with Nazi Germany. They don't have that knowledge of the history. And so they're using the term to denote that they haven't been vaccinated, that they're pure of this vaccine, that they view as a kind of poison. So my work is wanting to get into alternative narratives to some of these conspiracy narratives, but working with people in these communities to try and understand what actually happened in the pandemic, why some people were drawn towards these kinds of influences, to find a sort of middle path, if you like, or a path in which different sides have an ability to be heard and interact, and there will be conflict, but it's a kind of conflict that doesn't end in violence, but instead is one that promotes critical thinking and enables a kind of solidarity that has gone missing in these pandemic years of polarization. So it acknowledges the kernel of truth in some of this conspiracy. So as conspiracy does have a kernel of truth, it's not attempting to de-radicalize people, but more redirect them. And it's trying to meet people where they are at. So thinking in terms of some of the alternative narratives that I've been finding, one of them is when we think about the vaccination that occurred, the vaccine mandates, the opposition, the anti-vax, and then the pro-vax. Some interesting, I suppose, now that we've moved out of the lockdown environment, now that we've had mass vaccination, we've also had inquiries into some of that vaccination and found that some people have experienced side effects. So the kinds of concerns that people were mobilising around in the pandemic, the vaccine hesitancy actually had a grounding in lived realities that were being dismissed in many ways. And that doesn't mean advocating that people shouldn't be vaccinated, but it means acknowledging that for some people, there were actually damaging side effects. And through things like this parliamentary inquiry, more nuance can be brought in and more understanding and insight can be brought in to the kinds of public health communications around vaccination, the kinds of understandings of how it might impinge on different bodies, for example, and refining some of those mechanisms to bring more people along in future public health responses to pandemics, as they'll no doubt arise, given the way that we're living on the planet. So this is an interesting example for those who are in Australia, if you're not, or those who haven't heard of it. This is a former, or a doctor, Karen Phelps, who used to be a member of the Parliament and independent in New South Wales, who submitted to the inquiry, had previously been very in favour of the vaccine, but experienced some adverse side effects. Her partner was actually injured by a vaccine, and so she made a submission and wanted to draw the public attention to this, not because she's on a conspiracy bandwagon, but because she has a lived experience. So I think listening to some of these stories helps us to think about the nuances of why someone may decide not to be vaccinated, and rather than excluding them, think more in terms of how we can work with people and develop novel ways of approaching public health crisis. What can we learn from radicalisation and associated experiences of COVID-19 within alternative health and wellness communities? Some of the interviews that I've been doing shed some light on some of the experiences that people have had. I'm just in the process of doing these interviews, so I don't have a huge amount of data, but I'm happy to share some of the data with you now. So when we had Melbourne, for those who don't know, went through 6 lockdowns over 2020 and 2021, 3 long lockdowns, the third of which gave rise to a lot of civil unrest. It also was the time in which vaccine mandates were introduced for workforces that previously hadn't had vaccine mandates. So it led to a lot of public unrest and opposition. It led to demographics that previously had been on board with the public health response turning against it. It led to a lot of crossover also with transnational movements against some of the pandemic restrictions, and also an invocation of language around civil rights movements. For example, the idea reclaiming the line. So those who didn't want to be vaccinated, the idea that it was their right to not be vaccinated, and that if they were discriminated against, that would be a kind of segregation. So obviously it's an appropriation of civil rights language, and you may or may not think it's an appropriate one, but it was one that happened. And it's one that, again, in this study, trying to understand where people were coming from in their very staunch opposition to these rules, and not simply dismissing them as being whatever you might call them, I think is really important. So the sort of the perception, and one of the things that in radicalisation literature we always consider is the perception of deprivation, relative deprivation. So you might say, well, you know, these are people living in a first world country who have a government that actually cares about their lives and has enacted lockdowns to protect them. But from the perception of people in the community, that was not how it was lived. So the perception is really important to consider when thinking about this. And then only through really having that insight, I suppose, into someone's lived experience, can we actually formulate a response that then might bring people back and win the trust back of people that have actually lost trust in authorities. So taking seriously some of the claims that were being made, as abhorrent as they might feel when you do have perhaps a broader perspective on the pandemic, I think is really critical to this study. And it's the approach that I'm certainly attempting to take, even though at times I too, in interviews, have to sort of breathe and focus on my breathing, use my own yoga techniques, because it can be also difficult to listen to certain kinds of conspiracies and think of them in that way. And then also be careful about not telling people they're wrong. So it's a difficult space and a fraught space to be working in, but it's one that I find very useful to understanding radicalisation more broadly, but also as a member of wellness and health communities and yoga practitioner of 20 years, I have a lot of contacts in these communities who are also friends, who I don't always agree with, but who I can have a civil discussion with and learn from their experience in a way that is beneficial to this study. So as part of a project that I'm doing with colleagues at the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies at Deakin, Lydia Khalil, Josh Roos and Mark Duckworth, we are asking questions of a number of different demographics. The demographic in question for me is the alternative health and wellness community practitioner space. So we've asked a series of questions. The other members of the team are interviewing government representatives, so we're interviewing different cohorts within the community. But questions like, what is your perspective on the COVID pandemic? What's your perspective on the government response? How did the COVID-19 and restrictions and mandates impact you in the peak pandemic years? How might things have been done differently are the questions that we're asking. And some of the responses I've received so far reveal a variety of different understandings. So these are both female alternative and allied health practitioners. One of them thought this was an exercise in control. I'm not sure if it was planned. We talked a bit about the pandemic, Mickey Willis's documentary, because I'm not sure I want to go down that rabbit hole. So there's an awareness also of the conspiracy. So these were people that were not actually, they did adhere to public health protocols. They were both vaccinated, but they were also adjacent to a lot of people that didn't get vaccinated and that did take on certain kinds of conspiracy theories. So this person didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. But I think they really used the crisis to control people, to move money, the 5-kilometre radius, face masks, turning people upon each other. Another practitioner said, I suppose I was aware of SARS and certain zoonotic diseases. When I first heard about it, I immediately thought it's another one of those. I suppose there's that whole emotional thing that still comes up first, which is how it was handled in the state we live in Victoria and in Melbourne particularly. I sort of feel like it's inevitable there'll probably be another one because of the destruction of the environment and the way we're progressing into the ecosystems of the earth. There was a lot of condemnation in the interviews that I did of government approaches. So really a sense in which the government wasn't adequate or up to the task. And there's a lot of anger as well in the community and loss of work, but also the mental health traumas that are ongoing. And the idea that Victoria is one of the worst places in the world to go through the pandemic, the idea that it was draconian, the ongoing post-traumatic stress of members of the community, the suicides, it was the idea that it was inhumane. The notion of Daniel Andrews as a kind of sociopath was a dominant theme, and quite a lot of anger and also violent sentiment was expressed towards him. I did, in the interviews, we did talk a little bit about this trolley problem of the pandemic that authorities were facing, of having to implement policies that would have no really great outcome for anyone. So without a lockdown, many more deaths, with a lockdown, fewer deaths, but then other issues. And so there's sort of a no-win situation. But the way in which that played out here was that we did lock down in an extended way at times, which seemed to be inflected with some overreach in at certain moments. And this is the experience of these communities. But interestingly, and this is something I think this study I'm hoping to draw out more. I'm interested to see whether it emerges in other interviews with allied health practitioners, is this idea that there was no recognition of their role in the public health response. So the public health response was very much organised around a Western medical response. There was no recognition of the role of alternative health in that. There was a risk of getting a fine for practicing. There was a sense in which health was not something that was also linked to other aspects of the whole person. So it wasn't a particularly holistic approach. Allied health practitioners in the end were allowed to practice, but only in an emergency way. So someone couldn't say, I want to see my acupuncturist or my chiropractor for my mental health. You had to make up an excuse, a physical excuse like a migraine. Most of our businesses were completely destroyed because our patients were afraid. It became a mental health crisis by the second or third lockdowns. People were struggling, and the isolation had gotten to people so badly that a lot of clinics were telling their patients, just say your back's really sore or you've got a migraine and come in for a mental health issue. Others were told they couldn't work at all. A lot of people are now severely depressed as a result of that. It felt like the Victorian government's health approach is that they don't respect allied health. It felt like they didn't understand the benefit of allied health. And you look at how many people go to allied health practitioners, it's just incredible that we weren't part of the health response. Learning further from the perspectives of these allied health workers, the woman who was, one of the women I interviewed was a kinesiologist and said, you need to ask the body what's going on. Why can't we work with that? So her approach, when I asked them what they would do differently, was to suggest that governments work with allied health practitioners in future pandemic responses. So it's not about replacing one with another, but actually trying to work together. And then really anger and anxiety about lack of trust in governments, worries about corruption, big business. And, you know, my mind is blown when you look at what government actually is and what we need. So I want to finish by just reiterating the need to, my approach of moving from a call-out culture of calling out the anti-vaxxers to calling people in. So thinking more in terms of, well, why is someone taking this stance and how can we potentially work with them to move to a place of understanding? It's not necessarily an easy position to occupy. It's not a cure-all. There are always going to be bad actors seeking to profit from crises. But I think it's a way forward, and it's one that I'm continuing to work on, and would appreciate your critical feedback. Thank you.